There was a year when the sun disappeared. No prophecy warned of it. No empire could fight it. For more than half a decade, the sky turned to bronze, and the world forgot what warmth felt like. Crops failed. Faith faltered. Even the greatest cities became silent tombs of memory. But somewhere, in the quiet, a few people refused to forget the light. This is their story. A story not of kings or gods, but of farmers who kept seeds they could not eat, monks who wrote by candlelight while the world froze, and children who learned to laugh again beneath the forgiving sky. Tonight, on Forgotten Worlds for Sleep, we drift back to the year 536, the darkest winter in human history, and follow those who walked through the ashes of civilization. Until the sun remember how to rise, close your eyes. Let the noise of the day dissolve. The story begins when the light disappeared. The year was 536. The world awoke, but morning did not come. In Constantinople, 500,000 souls stirred beneath a sky that looked bruised, not bright. The sun rose, but it was wrong. A pale, colorless disk, shining like a coin dropped into a bowl of ink. Even the birds were silent. The great capital of the Eastern Empire, where marble domes once caught golden light, now shimmered in a dull bronze haze. Emperor Justinian, ruler of half the known world, stepped onto his palace terrace, expecting the familiar warmth that had greeted every dawn of his reign. Instead, the light that fell across the stones of his city felt cold, not the chill of winter, but a deeper absence, as though the fire of heaven itself had been dimmed. He turned toward the horizon. The sea that had always glimmered with morning's promise now lay flat and metallic, reflecting a sun stripped of its soul. Courtiers gathered behind him, whispering. They were men accustomed to interpreting every flicker of their emperor's expression, yet none could find words to match the sky before them. Can you imagine standing there, watching the world's rhythm falter? Would you think it an omen, or the beginning of something too vast for meaning? Across the city, bakers lit their lamps at dawn. Merchants opened their stalls to a light that belonged to no hour they recognized. The air itself felt heavy, as though the heavens had lowered closer to the earth. And beneath it all, a quiet, not peace, but a silence so complete that even prayer seemed afraid to speak. From the palace, Justinian sent riders to the observatories, to the churches, to the monasteries that kept the empire's calendars. The reports returned identical. The sun still rose at the appointed time, but its warmth was gone. The world, it seemed, was obeying its laws. Yet those laws no longer made sense. In the Hagia Sophia, still unfinished but already immense, candles flickered against mosaics of gold. Priests whispered the morning liturgy, their voices trembling as they wondered whether heaven still listened. One of them, an old monk with frost already in his beard, wrote in the margin of his scripture, "The light gives no heat. Perhaps we are being forgotten." Outside, the wind that moved through the streets carried a dry, metallic taste, the smell of stone, of ash, of air that had traveled far beyond the world and returned hollow. Children looked up, confused, asking why the day looked sick. Mothers had no answer. Fathers simply told them to stay near the fire, though even flames seemed weaker, less eager to live. And yet, the city continued to breathe. Carts rolled through the markets. Bells tolled from distant towers. Humanity, stubborn as ever, pretended the morning was ordinary, because to do otherwise was to admit that the familiar order of existence might have ended overnight. Have you ever watched something beautiful begin to die, and felt powerless to stop it? That was what the world felt in that first dawn of bronze light. Beyond the palace walls, a single raven flew toward the sea, black against a sun that no longer burned. No one saw it vanish into the fog. No one understood that its wings carried the first message of a new age, a warning written not in ink or prophecy, but in shadow. This was the morning without light, and the world, though still alive, had already begun to forget how to live. The city had always awakened to sound, to merchants calling across the markets, to the clang of blacksmiths, to the songs of fishermen leaving the harbor before dawn. But now, everything began slower. The light that touched Constantinople that morning did not belong today. It glowed like embers behind smoke. At first, the people thought it was fog, perhaps a storm from the north. But fog moves. Fog lifts. This light stayed, pressing down like a weight. Its color was not gray, nor gold, but something in between. A strange bronze that turned white marble to rust and blue water to tarnished steel. Women drew shutters over their windows. Children stopped mid-play, watching their shadows turn faint and strange. Even the dogs, restless and uneasy, barked at nothing and refused to leave doorways. In the grand market, merchants squinted at their parchments, holding them close to oil lamps though the hour was well past sunrise. They touched their coins and frowned. Gold had lost its luster. Silver looked sickly. The world's colors were wrong, as if God had forgotten the recipe for light. Can you imagine such a morning, when the sun still shines, but everything beneath it feels like a dream you can't wake from? Bread sellers hesitated to start their ovens. What was the point of baking when warmth itself had fled the world? Yet hunger is its own kind of faith. So they kindled their fires, kneaded their doughs, whispered their morning prayers, small gestures of defiance against a sky that no longer cared. Above them, smoke rose sluggishly, unable to climb high in the thick air. It hung over rooftops like a curtain. The air smelled faintly of metal, as though the city itself was burning very slowly, unseen. In the great cisterns beneath the streets, the water that had always mirrored torchlight turned dark and flat. Even reflections looked tired. The city's pulse, the rhythm of thousands of feet and voices, felt slower, like a heartbeat fading after fever. And yet life went on. Humans are remarkable that way. They move through disaster as if pretending can hold the world together. When the bells of Hagia Sophia tolled for the morning mass, people gathered. The cathedral glowed faintly in the bronze light, its rising dome cutting through haze like a ship through fog. Inside, priests sang hymns that echoed up into the half-finished vaults, their voices trembling not from fear, but from awe. Perhaps it is a test, one said, or a warning, another whispered. A young boy, holding a candle, looked up at the dim mosaics and asked, "Father, will the light come back?" The priest smiled, though his eyes betrayed doubt. "It always does," he said softly, a lie told with kindness. Can you feel that quiet between fear and faith? The space where people tell each other stories, not because they believe them, but because they must. As day faded, though it had never truly begun, the city seemed to sigh. The same bronze hue deepened into a reddish dusk, and for the first time in memory, the lamps were lit before noon prayers ended. From the palace towers, the emperor watched his capital disappear into shadow, a sea of dim fires glowing like stars fallen to earth. He whispered to himself, "If this is night, may dawn never return." Because dawn, it seemed, had forgotten them. He no longer slept. Each dawn, if one could still call it dawn, Justinian rose before the priest's bells, before the servants stirred, before even the wind dared to move. He would walk the marble corridors of his palace, hearing his own footsteps echo like memories through halls that once rang with power. The emperor had always believed that order was divine, that if men followed the laws of heaven, the world would keep its rhythm, crops would grow, seas would obey their tides, and empires would last. But now the rhythm was gone. The sun itself, the clock of creation, had lost its beat. He stood at the window, wrapped in robes meant for winter though it was spring. The light outside was thin and colorless. Even the Bosporus, that proud strait dividing two worlds, looked like a river of stone. Below, the city tried to live as it always had. Bells chimed from churches, their tones muffled by the heavy air. Smoke curled from bakeries, though the bread within refused to rise. Justinian watched, thinking of his people, the millions who depended on him to understand what was happening. But what is a ruler to do when the heavens themselves no longer answer? Can power mean anything when the sky refuses to obey? He turned to his advisors. who stood silently at a respectful distance. Their faces were pale in the dim light. Philosophers had no answers. Astrologers argued among themselves, some whispering of eclipses, others of omens foretold in forgotten texts. One even suggested that the sun had been devoured by unseen dragons. Justinian dismissed none of them. For the first time, reason and superstition seemed equally fragile. In the great hall, he ordered candles lit, hundreds of them, filling the air with sweet smoke. Their flames trembled under the draft, their glow painting the emperor's face with gold that no longer came from the sun. He stared into the flicker and whispered, almost to himself, "If this is judgment, then let it be seen." His wife, Theodora, entered quietly, once the most brilliant woman in the empire, fierce, cunning, unstoppable. She now looked tired, her beauty dulled by sleepless nights. "People are afraid," she said softly. "They say the world is ending." He turned to her. "The world ends every night," he murmured, "and yet each morning it returns." She looked at the window. "Does it?" For a long time, they stood together in silence. Beyond the glass, the sky shifted from bronze to iron, from iron to ash. No true day came. Later that evening, Justinian walked alone into the half-finished Hagia Sophia. The air inside was colder than outside. Dust drifted from the high dome like snow. He knelt before the altar, not as emperor, but as man. His prayer was not for victory, nor for power. It was for warmth, for a sign that the light still remembered the world. "Lord," he whispered, "if this is the end, grant me the courage to watch it." And in the silence that followed, he thought, or hoped. He heard something stir, like the faint breath of the universe itself. But it was only the wind, sighing through broken scaffolds. Have you ever prayed into emptiness, not for answers, but simply to feel less alone? That night, the emperor kept vigil until the candles burned low. When dawn came, it brought no change, only a dim, unending twilight. And yet he rose again, because even in darkness, duty demanded light. No empire could see it then, but far to the north, beyond the borders of every map, the sky itself was bleeding ash. Somewhere, perhaps in Iceland, perhaps in lands no Roman had ever charted, a mountain tore itself open. The earth, exhausted from its own stillness, released a scream that no man could hear but all would feel. A column of fire rose into the stratosphere, higher than the flight of any bird, higher than clouds, higher even than thought. Molten stone met the sky, and in that meeting, the world changed. Ash and sulfur, born from the planet's deep heart, began to drift east and west, weaving a veil that wrapped itself around the sun. And the sun, once a god to all, was suffocated. For weeks, no one understood. In Rome, men prayed. In Persia, priests fed their sacred flames more oil. In China, astrologers watched the horizon, writing that the sun gives light, but not heat. In Ireland, farmers knelt in the fields and pressed their hands into the frost, whispering that winter had come too early. The truth was simpler and crueler. The world had been cast into shadow by its own creation. The veil spread like smoke through the upper air, invisible to those below, but unstoppable. It turned days to dusk, seasons to ruin, and faith to silence. Have you ever watched something vast crumble, not with sound, but with quiet inevitability? That was how the light died. Not in fire, but in distance. From the northern seas to the deserts of Africa, the sky took on a copper tint. Birds lost their migrations. The fish that followed them wandered off course. The wind grew cold and strange, moving in directions no sailor could predict. The old farmers said even the soil felt heavier, as if the breath of the earth itself had slowed. In Constantinople, rumors spread faster than ash. Some said the sun was ill, poisoned by human sin. Others whispered that angels had turned their faces away, or that God had closed his eyes. But truth cares little for poetry. The air itself had become a mirror, scattering sunlight into oblivion. Night became day. Day became something else entirely. The stars shone faintly even at noon, and the moon, pale and distant, lingered longer than it should, as if watching the earth with pity. Ships at sea reported horizons that vanished mid-voyage. The compass still pointed north, yet north no longer felt the same. Men who had crossed oceans now feared to leave the sight of land. They said the world felt smaller, as though the heavens had drawn closer to press upon their sails. In the monasteries, monks began recording strange omens, blood-colored sunsets, pillars of light twisting over frozen lakes, flocks of dead birds falling from skies that gave no storm. And in their silence, they understood something terrible. The sun was not dying, but sleeping beneath a shroud it could not lift. In Persia's fire temples, the eternal flames began to gutter. Priests, who had guarded their brightness for generations, watched the sacred fires shrink despite constant tending. They whispered that the demons of darkness had broken loose, that Ahriman had escaped the underworld. In India, the Brahmins continued their rituals, perfect in every syllable, but their offerings burned weakly. The gods no longer hungered for smoke. In China, the emperor's astronomers wrote frantic reports that the mandate of heaven might have been withdrawn. How could the sun of heaven rule beneath a sky that refused to shine? And in the far north, in the frozen fjords where the Norse had not yet learned to write, stories began to take root. They spoke of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that would last 3 years before the gods met their end. The sagas had not yet been sung, but memory was already forming. The first myth born from the last sunlight. Can you feel it? That shiver beneath your skin when the world itself seems to pause. That's how it began, not with thunder or apocalypse, but with a breath held too long. For months, the veil thickened. Rain ceased. Rivers shrank. Each dawn was darker than the last, until the difference between waking and dreaming blurred completely. People lit lamps at midday and spoke of the world as if it were already gone, and somewhere beyond their sight, the ash continued to fall, fine as snow, silent as death, a whisper from the mountain that had torn the world in two. By the time the veil settled over the earth, even the oceans had forgotten how to glitter. The line between land and sky dissolved, and the world entered a silence so complete that it frightened even the mountains. Everywhere, people looked up, the same gesture repeated in every language, on every shore. They waited for warmth, for color, for something familiar to return, but the light that reached them was thin and foreign, like a memory that refused to fade, yet no longer felt alive. In Persia, fire temples glowed weakly through the haze. The priests of Ahura Mazda kept their sacred flames alive, with oil gathered from every corner of the empire. But even eternal fire seemed mortal now. Its smoke curled downward instead of rising, as if heaven had turned its back. In India, Brahmins chanted before altars heavy with fruit that would never ripen. Their offerings were perfect, the right incantations, the precise gestures, but the gods remained deaf. The smoke from their rituals lingered too long, trapped beneath the strange ceiling of the sky. Have you ever prayed for something that used to come easily? Sunlight, breath, an ordinary morning, and realized you're praying not to receive, but to remember? Across the deserts, caravans halted. Sand cooled beneath their feet, refusing to warm even at noon. Merchants who had crossed the Silk Road for decades now knelt and touched the ground as if feeling for a pulse that might confirm the earth was still alive. To the east, China's emperors consulted their astronomers. They measured the dim light, studied the color of the sun through silk veils, and wrote in their scrolls, "Heaven's lamp burns low. The cycle of harmony is broken." In the capital, the imperial gardens withered, the ponds froze. Peacocks wandered in silence through courtyards that once echoed with music. In the north, Celtic druids gathered at ancient stones and whispered that their ancestors had foreseen this. The long night, the time when the sun would hide until humankind remembered humility. They carved new symbols into old rock, believing that marks might outlive words if the end truly came. And far beyond any empire's map, in the fjords of the north, villagers who had no name for the Roman sun spoke of the Wolf Age beginning. Their children asked if the gods were dead. The elders said no, The gods were sleeping, but their voices shook when they said it. Across the western seas, in the jungles and river valleys of the Americas, the same story unfolded in another tongue. The maize refused to grow. The clouds brought rain that never reached the ground. Priests in feathered robes stood on stone pyramids, raising their arms toward a sky that ignored them. The people called at the time when the sun turned away. No one knew they were all living the same story. A Roman farmer, an Indian priest, a Chinese scholar, an Incan herder. Each believed his suffering was unique, a curse on his own land. But the veil was impartial. It bound the world together in darkness for the first time. The seas cooled. Fish fled to depths beyond reach. The winds changed their routes, confusing birds that had followed them for generations. Even the seasons lost their names. In Constantinople, a chronicler dipped his quill and wrote, "The air feels ill. The sun mocks us." He could not know that 1,000 leagues away, another hand, in another alphabet, was writing the same thing. What do you think binds humanity more? Its light or its suffering? When the sun disappeared, people learned that connection does not always need warmth. Sometimes it only needs fear. Month after month, the bronze light deepened to red. The moon rose too early, hung too long, and refused to fade at dawn. Children were born beneath that dim sky and grew up never knowing true daylight. Their eyes adjusted, but their spirits did not. And then came the frost. Snow fell in spring. Rivers froze in places where they had never known ice. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a sound, a sign, a heartbeat from heaven. But none came. Only silence, vast and endless, heavy enough to bend the spine of every prayer. And so humanity exhaled its first collective sigh, a soft, defeated sound that crossed oceans and mountains alike, a whisper carried by the same cold wind. We are alone. They were the first to know. Before emperors wrote decrees or monks recorded miracles, the farmers had already seen the end coming, written not in prophecy, but in soil, in the valleys of Greece, in the fields of Gaul, across the endless plains of Asia. Men woke to find their crops glittering with frost in midsummer. It was beautiful at first, like jewels scattered across the wheat. Then the wheat broke under its own weight, and beauty turned to ruin. The earth that had always responded to touch now felt numb, as if something deep beneath its skin had gone cold. Seeds did not sprout. Those that did grew pale and fragile, their roots curling back toward the surface, as though they no longer trusted what lay below. In a small village outside Constantinople, an old man knelt in his garden and pressed his hand into the ground. The dirt crumbled between his fingers, dry and lifeless. He whispered the same prayer he had spoken every planting season for 50 years. But this time, even his own voice felt hollow. Can you imagine believing that your hands could coax life from the earth, and then feeling it turn away from you? Across Europe, farmers tried everything. They dug deeper, hoping to find warmth. They built fires along the edges of their fields to trick the air into remembering summer. Some sang to the soil, old songs passed down from ancestors who had once sung to the rain. But the rain no longer listened. Cows stopped giving milk. Chickens laid fewer eggs. The rivers froze in places where no one had ever seen ice before, and the fish that used to swim near the surface vanished into darkness. People began to speak softly of curses, of divine punishment, of sins they could not name. In one coastal town, a woman stood by the sea, her feet buried in black sand. The tide came in like glass, clear, brittle, freezing. She dropped a handful of grain into the waves, an offering to whatever god still cared to watch. The grain sank without trace. Even the ocean, it seemed, had stopped breathing. When harvest time came, fields stood bare. In Gaul, entire villages gathered to reap crops that never grew. They knelt anyway, cutting invisible stalks, their scythes swinging through empty air, because ritual, even without reward, gave shape to despair. Have you ever done something you knew was hopeless, just because stopping would mean admitting it was over? That's what the harvest of 536 became. a performance for a vanished audience. By winter, desperation had replaced disbelief. People ate bark stripped from trees. They boiled leather shoes and belts until they softened enough to chew. In Ireland, monks wrote that grass became bread and hunger became prayer. In China, a poet described fields of ghosts where farmers plowed dust and sowed their tears. And yet, amid the collapse, life persisted in small, stubborn ways. A mother saved 3 seeds from the last barley she owned, hiding them in her child's blanket. A fisherman cut holes in the frozen river and prayed to the water beneath, throwing back the first fish he caught so that the river would not forget mercy. A monk wrote a single sentence in the margin of his book of Psalms. Even the sun may sleep, but the earth remembers. Everywhere, small lights flickered, gestures too small to rebuild the world, but enough to keep it from ending completely. But faith has limits. When the second year came, and the frost returned even stronger, people began to change. Neighbor watched neighbor. Families stopped sharing food. The old and the sick were left behind when villages moved inland in search of warmth. In the north, tales began to spread of families disappearing into the woods and never returning. Or worse, returning changed. What do you think happens first? The death of crops, or the death of kindness? In those frozen years, both seemed to wilt together. Still, the farmers woke every morning and looked toward the horizon, waiting for the sun to burn through the haze. It never did, but they waited anyway, because waiting was all that kept them human. By the time the third year began, they no longer prayed for harvest. They prayed for memory, for the world to remember warmth, and for their children to remember hope. Somewhere, beneath all that frost, a few seeds still slept, waiting for the return of spring that no one dared to believe in. And perhaps, even in the coldest year the world had ever known, that was enough. Long before the First Empire fell, people believed that flame was proof of life, a small, obedient sun they could hold in their hands. In temples, churches, and shrines across the world, priests kept that promise alive. They fed fires with oil, candles with beeswax, and faith with repetition. So long as the flames burned, they believed the heavens were watching. But when the great dimming began, the fires themselves began to waver. The priests of Persia noticed first. Inside their sacred Atashbirum, where eternal flames had burned for generations, the air grew cold. Even the oil seemed sluggish, as though reluctant to feed the fire. The priests leaned close and whispered prayers into the smoke, pleading with Ahura Mazda, the god of light, to restore his warmth. But the flames flickered weakly, their orange tongues shrinking to pale blue. One by one, the sacred fires dimmed, until the temple smelled not of devotion, but of extinguished hope. Have you ever tried to protect something that was already dying? Whispering to it, shielding it with your hands, pretending it could still hear you? That's what the priests did as they watched their god disappear in slow motion. Far to the west, in Constantinople, the Christian bishops gathered in candlelit halls. The light that filled their cathedrals came not from the heavens, but from tallow and smoke. Soot clung to mosaics, once meant to shimmer with divine gold. The faces of saints looked down through the haze, their eyes half lost in shadow. Each mass grew quieter. Each prayer echoed longer. People knelt not in confidence, but in confusion. When the bread of communion failed to rise, the clergy called it symbolic, a sign of humility. But in truth, they knew the yeast had died. Even the simplest miracles were impossible in a world without warmth. In the fire temples of Persia, the keepers began to lose faith. They fed the flames with wood meant for the hungry, and oil meant for lamps in homes that had gone dark. Every spark became an act of sacrifice. Yet no matter how much they gave, the fires continued to fade. In India, the Brahmins performed the Agnihotra, the daily fire ritual, just as their fathers and grandfathers had. They chanted mantras at dawn, their voices trembling as the cold air stole their breath. The flames rose for a moment, thin and transparent, then withered. The priests looked at one another and said nothing. To admit what they felt would have been heresy. that the gods had stopped listening. And across the eastern mountains, Buddhist monks who had spent lifetimes meditating on impermanence found that theory was no comfort when the world itself refused to change back. They lit lamps before statues of the Buddha, but the oil froze in its bowl. One monk, older than most remembered, whispered, "We have not transcended suffering. It has transcended us." Can you hear that silence? The kind that hums behind the last candle's breath, when even prayer seems too heavy to lift. In the West, Celtic druids gathered under black skies and tried to summon warmth through ancient songs. They circled their bonfires, chanting words so old their meanings had been forgotten. The flames rose, wild and defiant, but only for a moment. Then, one by one, the fires bowed to the wind. Everywhere, the priests of fire faced the same truth. Their gods had grown distant, or perhaps the gods were never gods at all, only reflections of a star they could no longer see. In the months that followed, faith itself began to shift. New prophets rose, preaching secret knowledge, promising that the darkness was divine, that humanity was being purified. Desperate people listened. If light had betrayed them, perhaps salvation now lived in shadow. It is strange, isn't it? How belief can survive the death of its object, like an echo that refuses to fade even after the sound has ended. By the year's end, the world had learned something the ancients never wanted to know. You can feed a flame with every last drop of faith, and it will still go out. But even in the ashes, a dull glow remained, not holy, not divine, but human. It was the stubborn warmth of hands that refused to let go of light, even when the sky itself had forgotten what light meant. And in that dim persistence, the world found the beginning of a new kind of faith, one that no god could extinguish, because it no longer belonged to heaven, it belonged to the heart. The monks of Clonmacnoise rose before dawn, as they always had. They gathered in silence, the air in their chapels so cold that their breath looked like ghosts escaping their bodies. They prayed in Latin, words older than any empire, but their voices trembled, and the echoes seemed to fade faster than before. In the kitchen, Brother Coleman bent over a wooden table. He pressed his palms into dough that should have risen overnight, but it hadn't. The lump sat there, dense and lifeless, as if the yeast had forgotten how to live. He leaned close, whispering to it as if it could still hear. "Rise, little one, please." His breath warmed the air for a heartbeat, then disappeared. Can you picture it? A man of faith, begging bread to perform a miracle that heaven no longer could. The monastery's oven burned weakly. The wood was damp from the endless frost. Even fire seemed tired now. The first loaf came out flat, gray, and heavy as stone. The monks broke it anyway, passing the pieces by candlelight. Each bite tasted of ash and salt, not from ingredients, but from the tears that fell unnoticed. Across the sea, in other monasteries, Iona, Kells, Bangor, the same thing was happening. Bread that would not rise, yeast that refused to wake, the simple rhythm of daily life, shattered by a cold too deep to understand. And still they prayed. They copied scripture by candlelight, their ink freezing mid-sentence. They painted gold halos around saints whose faces had begun to blur in the dimness. The pages curled from damp air, but they kept writing. They believed that as long as they recorded the word might record them back. Outside the monastery walls, the villagers came begging. Their hands were red from cold, their lips cracked from hunger. They carried children wrapped in thin wool, quiet, too quiet. The monks opened their gates. They gave what they could, scraps of broth, the flat bread that even they struggled to eat. One woman kissed the monk's hand after receiving her portion. Her lips left a mark of blood where her skin had split from the cold. In Rome, priests spoke of penance. In Constantinople, they preached endurance. But here, on this small island, faith had nothing left to promise except another sunrise that might never come. Have you ever wondered what prayer sounds like when it turns into a whisper of habit? No longer hope, just memory moving through the motions? Each evening, the monks gathered again for Compline, the night prayer. They chanted softly under their breath, voices low and weary. No one looked up at the crucifix anymore. They all stared instead at the single candle in the center of the room, the only light left that still obeyed. When Brother Finian fell ill, they wrapped him in blankets and placed him near the oven. He smiled weakly. "The warmth," he said, "feels like grace." Those were his last words. The bread still hadn't risen. Weeks later, when they buried him behind the chapel, the ground was so frozen that it took an entire day to dig through. The shovel rang against the earth like iron on stone. They prayed not for resurrection, but for rest. The annals of Ulster would later record the time in a single, stark line. A failure of bread from the year 536 to 539. 3 words, and yet within them lived the sound of empty stomachs, the silence of unanswered prayers, the slow unraveling of certainty itself. Still, something fragile endured. A monk's hand, trembling from hunger, drew a small cross at the edge of the parchment, a mark of faith, faint as breath on glass. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. He just needed to leave behind a sign that someone had tried to believe, even when belief no longer fed the body. Sometimes survival isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a line in a book no one will see for 1,000 years. A flat loaf of bread shared among starving men. A candle that burns, not to light a room, but to remind the dark that it hasn't won yet. And that, perhaps, was miracle enough. Cities are not meant to starve. They are made of noise and trade and laughter, the heartbeat of empires. But when the sun disappeared, the cities became mausoleums for abundance. Constantinople, once a jewel of marble and gold, turned gray. The streets where chariots once thundered were now filled with silence and the smell of smoke. The bakeries were the first to close, then the markets, then the docks, when the grain ships stopped coming from Egypt. By the end of that first year, hunger was not a rumor, it was the law. At dawn, people lined up before the imperial granaries, holding bowls, cups, even broken helmets to fill with grain. The guards tried to maintain order, but how do you enforce patience on an empty stomach? Children fainted where they stood. Mothers tore bread from one another's hands. In a single day, mercy became a luxury. From his palace, Emperor Justinian watched the riots from behind veiled windows. He had commanded armies, built cathedrals, rewritten the law itself. But against the hunger, he could only open his stores and pray it would be enough. It never was. In the forums, statues of gods and heroes were toppled for firewood. Marble cracked under heat that had once been reserved for sacrifice. In alleys, people whispered about hidden granaries, secret hoards. They searched cellars, temples, even tombs. The dead no longer frightened them, only the living did. Have you ever been so hungry that morality loses its shape, like frost melting in the sun? In Alexandria, where the desert met the sea, the docks were lined with ships whose sails hung in tatters. They brought no food now, only stories. Sailors told of villages swallowed by cold, of rivers frozen solid, of seas that refused to give fish. The city scholars, who once measured the stars, now counted days by deaths. They boiled parchment for soup, scraping words from the past into thin broth. Rome fared no better. Its great amphitheaters stood empty, the sound of cheering replaced by coughing and quiet sobs. The aqueduct still ran, but the fountains had dried, their water redirected to the few gardens that still tried to grow. In the catacombs beneath the city, families slept among bones, seeking the trapped warmth of the earth. The once eternal city had become a whisper. In Constantinople, Theodora, empress, once a symbol of grace and defiance, opened soup kitchens in the churches. She sold her jewels to buy what little grain remained. But even gold had lost its power. You can't eat a coin. You can't feed a city with faith alone. One chronicler wrote that the people became like shadows walking in daylight. Thin, silent, almost transparent, ghosts of themselves. They no longer prayed for salvation. They prayed for sleep, because sleep at least felt full. Have you ever noticed how quiet hunger is? It doesn't scream. It waits. It empties you. piece by piece, until you become the silence itself. In those cities, the old divisions vanished. Senators stood beside beggars, priests beside thieves. When food disappears, every title becomes the same, one more mouth. Yet amid the despair, there were still sparks of kindness. A soldier gave his ration to a child he didn't know. A widow shared her last crust of bread with a dying cat. Tiny mercies, too small to save the world, but enough to keep it human. By the second year, entire neighborhoods were abandoned. People moved toward the ports, hoping for ships that never came. The great marketplaces became burial grounds. The smell of bread had been replaced by the smell of decay. And yet, in the darkest corners, a strange stillness took root. When there was nothing left to eat, when no one left to trade with, the city finally rested. The noise of civilization, the carts, the shouting, the deals, faded into memory. What remained was breathing, slow and shallow, like a dying man dreaming of his youth. Constantinople still stood. Rome still stood. Alexandria still stood. But they were no longer cities. They were shells, beautiful, empty, echoing with the sound of wind moving through forgotten streets. Some said the world had ended. Others said it was only sleeping. But for those who lived inside the hunger cities, there was no difference. The light had gone out, and the silence had begun. In the palace of Constantinople, the emperor sat in silence. The marble walls that had once gleamed with light now absorbed it, dull and gray. Even the mosaics of Christ above his throne seemed to fade, their gold turning to bronze in the strange, lifeless glow that passed for daylight. Justinian had spent his life believing the empire was eternal. He had rebuilt churches, raised armies, rewritten the laws of men and angels alike. He had spoken the language of conquest and called it divine purpose. But now, even his own reflection in the polished floor seemed to waver, as if the darkness had begun eating the shape of power itself. Outside, the city moaned. The plague had not yet come, but hunger already ruled. His guards had stopped saluting. His ministers avoided his gaze. And still, every morning, Justinian stood before his window, staring into the sky that no longer answered. Have you ever looked at something you thought was infinite, a love, a dream, a belief, and realized it was dying quietly before your eyes? One night, unable to sleep, the emperor walked alone through the corridors of his palace. The braziers had burned out. The air smelled of old incense and damp stone. He passed the chapel, where a single candle flickered before an icon of the Virgin. The wax had melted into a shape that looked like a tear. He fell to his knees. "Why have you hidden your face from us?" he whispered. But no voice replied, not even the echo of his own. Later, he summoned his court theologian, a thin man named Theophanes. "Tell me," Justinian asked, "is this the end of days?" Theophanes hesitated. "Majesty," he said softly, "perhaps it is only the end of our pride." The emperor turned away. Outside, snow was falling in spring. The flakes clung to the windows like ash, melting into the glass before they vanished. In the morning, Theodora found him still there, watching the horizon. Her hair was wrapped in black silk, her face pale as the sky. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Eat something," she said. But the table beside him was untouched, the bread hard, the wine frozen in the cup. "Do you think God has left us?" he asked her. She looked at him for a long time before answering. "No," she said. "I think he's waiting to see what we'll do without him." That night, Justinian ordered the Hagia Sophia reopened, though the priests had begged him to conserve the oil. He wanted the lamps lit, every one of them, and so they burned. Thousands of small flames flickered against the great dome, trembling like stars trapped inside a dying world. The people came, thin, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags. They filled the vast cathedral and knelt on the marble floor. The emperor stood before them, his voice low, his crown heavy. He did not speak of glory or empire. He spoke of endurance, of light remembered and light yet to come. "When the sun returns," he said, "it must find us still here." But even as he spoke, A gust of wind swept through the open doors. Dozens of candles went out, leaving the dome shrouded in shadow once more. Some took it as a sign of divine anger, others divine indifference. Justinian said nothing. Have you ever tried to lead others through darkness while doubting the path yourself? Weeks later, he ordered ships sent south, to Egypt, to Syria, to anywhere that might still have grain. Most never returned. The few that did brought news worse than famine. They spoke of sickness, a sickness that spread like a whisper, carried by the same winds that had stolen the sun. That night, Justinian dreamed of the old world, of sunlight on marble, of golden mosaics blazing with warmth. He reached for them, but his hands passed through the images like smoke. When he woke, the palace was colder than before. He looked out at the dawn, a dull red glow behind the clouds, and whispered, almost to himself, "If this is judgment, let it be complete." The empire did not answer. The sky remained silent, and somewhere far below, in the narrow streets where beggars slept and dogs scavenged, a new sound began to rise, coughing, low and wet, carried on the morning air. The emperor closed his eyes. He had rebuilt the world once before, but now, as the first plague ships crept into the harbor, he understood the truth. You can rebuild walls, but not warmth. You can rewrite laws, but not light. And no empire, not even his, can command a sun that has chosen to forget. They came in spring, slow, quiet, and heavy with secrets. From a distance, the ships looked ordinary. Grain vessels from Alexandria, their sails torn but serviceable. The city's watchers on the walls cheered. After years of famine, the sight of cargo on the horizon meant hope. Food, finally. But hope, like hunger, has a taste. And this one would turn to ash. When the first ship docked, its crew did not answer the harbor master's calls. The deck was littered with bodies. Those still breathing had black swellings under their arms and between their thighs. The smell was wrong, not rot, but something sweet and sickly, like fruit gone bad. The guards recoiled. Then, too late, they carried the sick ashore. Within a week, the city changed. The hungry became the dying became the dead, and the dead began to multiply faster than the priests could bless them. Have you ever watched a miracle run backward? Life unraveling faster than it can be named? The physicians called it a fever of the blood. The priests called it judgment. The people called it the Black Breath. No one understood what it was, only that it spread faster than fear. In the streets of Constantinople, the sound of coughing replaced prayer. Men collapsed at market stalls. Women fell with infants in their arms. The great cisterns that had once stored water now filled with corpses when the graveyards overflowed. The air grew thick, humming with flies and silence. Procopius, the historian, wrote, 10,000 die each day, and later, the number is greater still. But numbers could not capture the truth. They could not measure the weight of a world rotting from within. In the harbor, the ships kept coming, each one slower, emptier, quieter. By the time the sailors reached port, half were already dead. The rats came next, their small feet whispering across the stones, their fleas carrying invisible death. No guard could stop them. They were the new conquerors. One evening, a group of priests gathered to carry the bodies to the sea. They sang hymns as they worked, their voices trembling in the cold air. By dawn, only one priest remained alive to finish the song. Have you ever thought about how thin the line is between a prayer and a scream? In the palace, Emperor Justinian fell ill. The court went silent. No one dared speak of what it might mean if the chosen of God were dying too. Theodora stayed by his side, her hand resting on his chest as if willing his heart to keep beating. The emperor's fever came in waves, heat and ice, delirium and silence. He called out to names no one recognized. Then, on the seventh night, he fell still. For hours, the city held its breath. And then he lived. Barely. The people called it a miracle, though many wondered if the gods had spared him or simply forgotten to finish the job. By summer, the plague had consumed the empire. Caravans stopped traveling. Merchants buried their goods and fled. In the countryside, entire villages disappeared. Doors swinging open, meals half-eaten, silence where laughter used to be. The earth, already barren from the vanished sun, now carried the weight of unburied dead. The chroniclers ran out of ink. The priests ran out of words. There were too many names to remember, too many faces to mourn, and so the living began to forget on purpose. It was the only way to survive. Have you ever wondered what it means to keep living when the world around you doesn't? At night, the harbor burned, not with fire, but with lanterns set adrift to carry the dead out to sea. Hundreds of small lights floated away from the shore, vanishing one by one into the mist. From the city walls, it looked like the stars themselves were sinking. When the wind shifted, it carried the sound of the bells tolling, slow, distant, endless. No one counted them anymore. Every ring was the same message. You are still here. For now. The last ship from Egypt never made it to port. It drifted, anchorless, with its crew long dead, circling the harbor like a ghost refusing to rest. The gulls that once followed such vessels stayed away. Even they seemed to understand. And so the sea, once the empire's lifeline, became its graveyard. The waters that had brought wealth now carried death, and every ripple against the shore sounded like a warning too late to hear. The plague ships had come, and with them, the final lesson of the vanished sun. It was never the darkness that ended civilizations. It was what the darkness taught us to do to each other when it stayed too long. By the time the bells stopped ringing, there was no one left to ring them. The ropes hung loose in the towers, swaying gently in the wind that carried the scent of salt and decay. Constantinople had fallen quiet, not through conquest or rebellion, but through absence. The streets were lined with carts that no longer moved. Shutters banged in empty rhythm against stone walls. The sound of footsteps, once constant, had vanished. Even the dogs had stopped barking. Silence had claimed the city more completely than any army ever could. In the great church, the candles still burned, but only because no one remained to extinguish them. Wax pooled around the base of the altar, congealing like time itself. The air shimmered faintly from the heat, a mockery of the sun that had forgotten to shine. Outside, the dead lay in rows, their faces turned toward a sky that refused to look back. Some clutched crosses, others scraps of bread. Faith and hunger had become indistinguishable in the end. Have you ever stood somewhere once full of voices and felt the air ache for sound? That was Constantinople in the year 542, a city listening to itself die. The chroniclers stopped writing. Their quills dried beside the bodies they could no longer describe. One left a final note before his ink ran out. It is not death that terrifies me, but the silence after it. In the palace, curtains hung unmoving. Theodora walked the halls barefoot, her steps echoing faintly in chambers that had once held the laughter of courtiers. Every whisper felt too loud now. Even the emperor spoke in murmurs, as if afraid to wake the dead. The plague had spared Justinian, but only to make him its witness. He ordered trenches dug outside the walls. At first, they buried 10 at a time, then 100, then thousands, until the earth itself seemed to sigh under the weight. Soon, there were no gravediggers left. The living were too few and too weak. Bodies piled in courtyards, on stairways, in marketplaces. They filled the cisterns meant to store water. They filled the harbors, floating face down, carried by the tide that had once brought life. Still, the emperor ordered prayers to continue. But who was left to pray? The priests were gone. The choirs had gone silent. Only the wind sang now, moving through broken windows in a minor key. Have you ever noticed how grief becomes a kind of music when it's all that remains? Far from the capital, in the countryside, villages lay abandoned. Fields turned to wild grass. The roads that had once led to markets now led only to dust. The empire was still there on maps, but not in the world. Yet among the ruins, a few survived. A boy and his sister scavenging bread crusts from the bones of the city. a fisherman mending his net on a river that no longer had fish, a monk walking barefoot through the streets, ringing a handbell for the souls no one else would mourn. He stopped at every corner, whispered a single phrase, and moved on. Sleep, children of God. The dawn will remember you. The bell's thin chime rose and fell, the last heartbeat of a civilization too tired to fight. When night came, the stars were clearer than they had been in years. The haze that had choked the sky began, slowly, to thin, but there was no one left awake to see it. The silence deepened, not cruelly, not even sadly, but tenderly. It wrapped the world in something almost like peace. The earth, exhausted by centuries of noise and ambition, had finally closed its eyes. And somewhere in that stillness, life waited. Not gone, only sleeping. Because even silence, if you listen long enough, begins to hum again. Can you hear it? That faint vibration beneath the quiet. That is the sound of the world remembering itself. In the centuries that followed, people would tell stories about this time. Of the vanished sun, the endless hunger, the plague that turned cities into cemeteries. But they would never capture the sound of it. That vast, aching pause between what was and what would come next. For in the silence of the dead, the living learned something no empire ever had. That all things, even ruin, can be beautiful when the world finally rests. When the last bells of Constantinople fell silent, a few still breathing gathered at the city's edge. They had no banners, no leaders, no destination, only a shared impulse to move, to leave the stone graves behind and follow the faintest scent of life. Among them was a woman named Alara, though no one called her by name anymore. Names had become a luxury of the past, like bread or laughter. She carried a small leather pouch tied around her neck. Inside were seeds, barley, lentils, a handful of wheat kernels, each one saved through hunger so deep it bordered on madness. She had promised her husband she would keep them safe. He had died during the second plague month. His last words a whisper, "If the sun returns, feed it these." And so she walked. The land beyond the walls was quiet, but not empty. Abandoned farms lay like skeletons across the hills, their fields overrun with weeds that had learned to thrive in cold soil. In the distance, smoke rose from a handful of huts, proof that someone, somewhere, still believed in fire. Alara joined others along the road, a monk carrying a cracked bell, a child with no shoes, holding a wooden cup, a soldier without a sword, leading a mule that carried bones wrapped in linen. They didn't speak much. Words felt too heavy now. Have you ever been so tired that even hope feels like a burden? At night, they slept in ruins, old temples, half-collapsed barns, the hollow ribs of ships left stranded by the receding sea. Sometimes, the wind sounded like voices, and they would listen, half believing the dead were still trying to guide them. The days were gray, the sun still veiled but faintly warmer than before. Once, when the clouds thinned, the group stopped walking and just stared at the sky. The light was pale and fragile, not gold, but silver. It felt unreal. Some began to cry. Others shielded their eyes, as if afraid it might vanish again if looked at too directly. Alara didn't cry. She opened her pouch and held a seed in her palm, letting the light touch it. For the first time in years, it glimmered. They traveled north, through villages turned to dust, rivers turned to thread. Now and then, they found remnants of other survivors, a loaf of stone-hard bread, a burned book, a child's toy buried in snow. Each fragment felt sacred, proof that the world had existed once and might, somehow again. On the 10th night, they reached a valley where the wind was softer. A brook still ran, trickling weakly between stones blackened by ash. There they stopped. No one said it aloud, but they knew this was far enough. Alara knelt and cleared a patch of earth with her hands. The soil was stiff, cold, reluctant. She pressed her palm against it and whispered, "Wake up." Then she opened the pouch and poured the seeds out one by one, planting them in small, uneven rows. The monk rang his bell once, the sound low and hollow, like a prayer made of iron. The child filled the furrows with water from her cup. They waited. Nothing happened. Have you ever planted something just to believe that tomorrow might still exist? Days passed. The group built small shelters, shared what little food remained. Some fell ill and did not rise. Ilara tended to the soil every morning, brushing away frost, humming softly. She no longer prayed to heaven. She prayed to the dirt. Then, one morning, she saw it. A thin, trembling shoot breaking through the ground, green as breath. It was nothing, a single blade, fragile enough to vanish in a sigh. And yet, it was everything. She called the others. They gathered around in silence, afraid even to exhale. The monk crossed himself. The soldier knelt. The child laughed, the sound small, but startling, like the first bird after winter. The valley would never become a city. The fields would never match the abundance of the old world. But that little patch of green meant that life, stubborn and small, had refused to die. Ilara touched the sprout with her fingertips. The warmth of her skin met the coolness of the leaf, two survivors recognizing each other. And in that moment, she understood something the empires never had. That civilization is not marble or gold or glory. It is this, a single seed that someone refused to eat, a memory buried, waiting to be reborn. When night fell, they built a fire. For the first time in years, its light reached the clouds. And though the stars above were pale, for a heartbeat, the world no longer looked lost. They were the first to be born without memory of light. The children of the ashes, thin, quiet, wide-eyed, came into a world still trying to remember itself. Their parents told stories about the sun, about fields that shimmered gold and oceans that glowed blue. The children listened politely, but the words meant little. To them, warmth was something imagined, like dragons or angels. They grew up beneath a sky that was gray even on its best days. When it rained, they danced barefoot in the mud. When the cold came, they huddled together and pretended it was an adventure. They did not cry for what was lost, because loss to them was normal. Ilara's small valley became a village of sorts. More survivors found their way there. Fishermen, wanderers, monks. They built homes from scavenged stone and driftwood, patching gaps with clay and prayer. Each spring, they planted again, even when the soil gave little. Each harvest, they gave thanks, not for abundance, but for endurance. The children learned to count not by years, but by winters survived. They carved tally marks into the walls, thin scratches of persistence. They learned to speak softly, as if sound itself might frighten away what fragile peace remained. One boy, Kalen, asked Ilara one evening, "Is it true the sun used to burn your skin?" She smiled. "It was warm, yes." "How warm?" he pressed. "Warm enough to make rivers sing," she said. He laughed. "Rivers don't sing." They did once. He didn't believe her, but he liked the sound of the story. Have you ever realized that disbelief can be its own kind of innocence? The monks in the valley began keeping new records, not of kings or wars, but of seeds that sprouted, of rains that returned. They wrote on scraps of parchment, then on bark, then on smooth stones when ink ran out. History had become simple again, survival recorded as scripture. At night, they gathered by the fire. The elders told tales of the vanished sun, of a world that once glittered with gold and vanity. The children listened with tilted heads, half asleep, imagining a sky that glowed not with fire, but with kindness. To them, light had never been something to lose. It was something to invent. One night, when the fire burned low, Kalen looked up and saw a faint shimmer through the clouds. He rubbed his eyes. At first, he thought it was a dream, but the shimmer grew, trembling, pale and new a star. Just one. He tugged at Ilara's sleeve. "Look," he whispered. She lifted her gaze, and for the first time in years, her eyes filled with something brighter than grief. It wasn't much, a single pinprick in a sky too vast for comfort, but to them, it was a sign, a reminder that the world still remembered how to shine. The next morning, the children climbed the nearest hill to see if more stars would appear when night returned. They carried sticks like banners and sang songs they made up on the way. Their voices rose through the thin air, awkward and out of tune, but alive. Ilara watched from below, the old leather pouch still tied around her neck. Inside, a few seeds remained. She ran her thumb over them and smiled. Maybe she would plant them next spring. Maybe the children would see real fields one day. Maybe the world was finally ready to forgive itself. Have you ever watched someone younger step into a world that almost ended and felt both envy and peace? In the years that followed, the children grew tall and strong. They built boats, simple at first, then braver, curious about what lay beyond the valley. They carved patterns into the wood, spirals, suns, waves, symbols of things they had never seen, but somehow remembered. When they pushed the first boat into the water, the river, now fuller than before, caught it gently. The children cheered as it floated away, gliding toward a horizon still gray, but open. And that night, when they returned to their fires, they saw not one star, but several, faint trembling but there. The sky, at last, had begun to breathe again. Ilara closed her eyes and whispered to the dark, "Remember this time." Because she knew, even light, once returned, can be forgotten again. And so the children of the ashes became the keepers of tomorrow, born from ruin, but carrying seeds of dawn. The thaw began quietly. No trumpets, no miracles, just a single drop of water sliding down the edge of an icicle. It fell, struck the ground, and vanished into the soil. But in that small sound, the world exhaled for the first time in years. Across the valleys, the rivers began to move. At first, only a trickle, a hesitant whisper, like someone waking from a long dream. Then a murmur, a hum, and finally a song. The ice cracked and retreated, the water beneath alive and restless. The people came to listen. They stood on the banks, staring at the current as if watching time itself return. Some wept, others just knelt, touched the surface, and pulled their hands back in disbelief. The cold was still there, but it no longer bit, it kissed. Ilara watched from the same hill where she had buried her first harvest. Her hair had turned white, her hands worn like river stones. But when she saw the water glint in the pale sunlight, she smiled. "It remembers," she whispered. The children, no longer children now, began to build bridges and mills. They carved channels to lead the river's energy into wooden wheels. For the first time in decades, the sound of work returned. A creak, a splash, a rhythm that felt like heartbeat. Have you ever realized that silence can make even the smallest sound feel sacred? The forests followed next. Green crept back into the hills, cautious at first. Saplings rooted in the ashes of old trees. Moss crawled across the stones where bones once lay. Each leaf that opened was an act of defiance, a soft rebellion against the memory of death. Birds returned too. Their songs were shy, uncertain, as if they feared being overheard by the winter that had nearly erased them. When the first nightingale sang, the valley froze, not from cold, but awe. Its voice was fragile, a single thread of sound weaving through the air. Ilara closed her eyes and cried. "I'd forgotten," she said, "how beautiful noise can be." The rivers spread their silver fingers, reaching into old riverbeds that had turned to dust. They carried soil, seeds, memory, and with every bend, the land grew softer. But not everyone trusted the warmth. Some still built fires each night, even in spring. Others stored food obsessively, afraid that the hunger would return as suddenly as it had once come. They told their children, "Never believe the sky. It can forget you again." Have you ever tried to love something while fearing it at the same time? That's what it felt like to stand in the sunlight after so many years of shadow. The monks who recorded these days wrote not in scripture, but in poetry. One verse survived, carved into stone near the valley's edge. The water came home. The wind forgave the land, and the land forgave us. By the time the rivers reached the sea again, the world had changed. The salt water was still gray, the waves weak, but they were moving. Fishermen returned to the shore, mending nets with trembling hands. When they caught their first fish, they didn't eat it. They released it back into the water, whispering thanks. No one wanted to be greedy with grace. One evening, Kalen stood at the riverbank, watching the current pull gold light through the shallows. He turned to Alara and said, "Do you think it will stay this time?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I think," she said softly, "the world has learned how to breathe again, but we should still listen in case it forgets." He nodded, though he didn't understand. The young rarely do, but years later, when he had children of his own, he would tell them the same words. The rivers would outlive them all, flowing quietly through the bones of empires that no longer mattered. And perhaps that was fitting, because the rivers, more than any crown, any temple, any name, were the true memory of the world. When the moon rose that night, its reflection rippled on the water like a wound finally closing. The people of the valley slept without dreams. For the first time in generations, the world was not ending. It was beginning again. At first, no one called it summer. The word felt dangerous, like saying a forbidden name aloud. The warmth had returned, but trust had not. For generations, the people had learned to live beneath the shadow, to measure life in degrees of gray. Now, sunlight spilled across the hills, and it frightened them. Children ran from the brightness, shielding their eyes. Elders stayed indoors, whispering that it was a trick, that the sky was only pretending to forgive them. When the wind blew warm through the valley, some wept. They said it sounded too much like the breath of a sleeping god, the one who might wake and take it all away again. Have you ever been afraid of something beautiful, simply because it reminds you how much you've lost? The first true summer came quietly. The river ran strong, the grass thick and gold at its edges. The trees bore fruit so heavy the branches bent, but the people hesitated. They harvested little, as if taking too much might anger the sky. The famine had trained their hearts to distrust abundance. Alara, now old and stooped, sat before her hut, watching children play among the new wildflowers. Their laughter made her smile, though she noticed how some still flinched when thunder rolled in the distance. Even joy had an echo of fear. Kalen, her grown apprentice, tried to convince the villagers to plant more. "The earth is ready," he said. "It wants to live again." But they shook their heads. They remembered. They always remembered. The monks recorded these days with careful detachment. The sun warms, yet the heart remains cold. They wrote that trust was the last thing to return after the world had ended. At night, the air was softer. The stars had multiplied. Tiny sparks scattered across the recovering sky. Children pointed at them, inventing new constellations. But the adults did not look up. Looking up still hurt. The first heat wave came late that year. It was not dangerous, not by any old measure, just warm. But warmth now felt like warning. People whispered, "It's starting again." When the river levels dropped by an inch, they stopped drinking from it. When the crops browned at the tips, they buried offerings in the soil. Every shift of weather carried the ghost of apocalypse. Have you ever tried to heal from something that never truly ended? Kalen, restless and young, refused to live in fear. One morning, he climbed the same hill where Alara had once planted her first seeds. The sky above him was cloudless, a soft blue so bright it felt unreal. He stretched out his arms and let the sun hit his face. For a long time, he didn't move. When he returned, his skin was red, his eyes filled with wonder. "It didn't burn me," he said. The villagers stared at him as though he'd committed blasphemy. Alara smiled faintly. "It's time," she whispered. "Time for what?" "To stop being afraid of the light." That evening, she gathered the villagers. They stood by the riverbank as the sun sank, gold and immense, the first true sunset in living memory. The children giggled, the adults trembled. Alara took a small loaf of bread, baked from the year's first full harvest, and broke it in half. She handed one piece to Kalen. "Eat," she said. He hesitated. "What if it goes away again?" "Then we will remember," she answered, "and plant again." They ate in silence. The taste was strange, sweet, warm, alive. Tears came easily. For some, from gratitude. For others, from terror. That night, when the villagers lay awake, listening to the chirping of unseen insects, they realized something had shifted. The fear was still there, but softer now, threaded with something fragile and necessary. Hope. The monks would later write. The people began to eat the sunlight again. And in the morning, when the first rays touched the valley, no one hid. They stepped out slowly, blinking, breathing, unsure. The warmth fell on their faces, and the shadows beneath their eyes melted just a little. It was not faith that returned first, nor joy, but the simplest thing of all, the willingness to believe that the world might not end today. When the light finally returned, the fear did not vanish. It simply changed shape. People no longer feared the dark. They feared forgetting it. At first, they tried to talk about what had happened, the vanished sun, the hunger, the plague. But the memories felt too large for words. When they spoke, the sentences fell apart, dissolving into silence. It was the monks who decided to save what speech could not. In the valley, on smooth stones and scraps of parchment, they began to write. Not history, not prophecy memory. Each monk carried his own piece of truth, a story, a name, a single detail no one else remembered. Together, they built a mosaic of survival. One recorded the year the bread stopped rising. Another wrote of the rivers turning to glass. A third described the sound of the sky when the sun disappeared, like breath caught in the throat of God. They called themselves the Keepers. Every morning, they walked to the edge of the valley and faced east. They bowed, not in worship, but in witness, because what they had seen was not divine. It was the absence of divinity, and somehow, they had lived through it. Have you ever wanted to remember something painful, just so you never have to live it again? Kalen, now grown and strong, helped them carve their words into stone. He had little patience for scripture, but he understood the power of story. The world will forget, he said. They always do. Ilara nodded. Then let's teach them how to remember. They began teaching the children to write, tracing letters into ash before setting them to parchment. Their first lesson was not the alphabet, but a warning. Never mock the dark. It can return. At night, by firelight, the elders told tales of the lost sun. They spoke of the famine years, of the rivers that froze, of the silence that swallowed entire cities. But they didn't tell it as tragedy. They told it as a promise. That light, even when gone, could be found again. The children listened wide-eyed, their faces glowing orange in the firelight. To them, it sounded like a legend, too vast to be real. They could not imagine a world without sunlight, just as their ancestors had once been unable to imagine its absence. And perhaps that was the point. The keepers continued their work. They traveled from valley to valley, collecting stories from other survivors, fragments of truth, like broken pottery. In one ruined monastery, they found a book half burned but still legible. Inside, a single line survived. If the world forgets this, it will happen again. They copied it onto every page they filled thereafter. Have you ever thought that memory itself might be a form of prayer? In time, the keepers' writings grew into something more, a map of endurance. It marked where the rivers had returned, where crops could grow, where villages still whispered at dusk. They used it not to claim land, but to remind the future that once, the earth had almost stopped breathing. Kalen added his own entry. We feared the dark, but the dark was never our enemy. It was our mirror. Years later, travelers from distant regions began to visit the valley. They brought their own tales of frozen seas, of children born with hair white as snow, of gods who had fallen silent. The keepers listened and wrote, their walls filled with lines and symbols, hundreds upon hundreds of voices woven into a single human memory. When Ilara died, the monks carried her pouch of seeds to the edge of the river and buried it beneath a tree. They marked the spot with one sentence carved into stone. She remembered when the world forgot. The tree grew fast. By the next generation, its roots had spread so deep that even drought could not kill it. Its leaves were a strange silver green, the color of light reborn, and when travelers passed through the valley and asked what it was called, the villagers answered softly, "The place that remembers." Have you ever realized that survival isn't enough? That you must also carry the memory of how you survived? The keepers knew that someday the descendants would no longer fear the sky. They would laugh freely under summer suns, never imagining that the light could fade again. And that was fine, perhaps even merciful. But the stones would remain, the words would remain, and in every story told around a fire, a fragment of the dark would whisper back, "Don't forget me. I made you." They left at dawn, before the valley had fully woken. The air was cool, damp with the promise of rain. Behind them, smoke from morning fires rose in thin threads, a signal of life, small and fragile, disappearing into the light. There were 5 of them: Caelan's son, a girl named Mira who sang to herself when afraid, a monk who had forgotten his name, a hunter with one eye, and a boy who claimed he could still hear the dead in the wind. They called themselves the Wanderers, not because they sought glory, but because staying still had begun to feel like dying. They carried few things: bread, dried herbs, a scrap of parchment bearing the keeper's seal, and stones etched with words from the valley. Remember the dark. Cherish the light. Never waste either. When they reached the edge of the river, they hesitated. The water glittered gold under the early sun, swift and alive. None of them had ever crossed beyond the far bank. Caelan's son, Eric, stepped forward first. He turned once toward the valley, where the great silver-green tree shimmered. Then he stepped into the current. The others followed. The water was cold, but not cruel. It wrapped around their legs like a promise. When they reached the other side, they felt lighter, as if they had crossed not a river, but a boundary between past and future. Have you ever left a place that loved you, just because you needed to see what existed beyond its love? The land beyond was strange. Forests half reborn, half haunted. Stone towers swallowed by ivy. Fields where the grass grew too tall, hiding the ruins of old walls. Everywhere, echoes of a world that had once believed itself immortal. They found traces of others, footprints, ashes, songs scratched into the sides of trees. One carving read, "We walked until the earth forgave us." Mira would stop often, listening to the wind. She said it carried whispers, fragments of prayers left unfinished. The others laughed, but quietly, afraid she might be right. For weeks, they followed the sun. It was still pale, but steady now, a loyal companion. They slept in the open, under skies that seemed wider each night. Sometimes, when the moon was full, they saw strange lights on the horizon, flickers like campfires, too distant to reach. Proof that the world was still populated by someone, somewhere. They spoke often of what they might find: a city untouched by the dark, an ocean that still glittered, a people who had forgotten fear. Eric kept a small book of sketches. He drew rivers, trees, faces. One page was left blank, for the place they were searching for, though none of them could name it. Have you ever gone looking for something you didn't believe existed, only because the search itself made life worth living? On the 40th day, they reached a plain where the wind never stopped. It roared softly through the grass, bending it in waves. In the distance, they saw what looked like stone pillars rising from the earth. As they drew closer, they realized it was the remains of a great road, smooth, ancient, leading straight toward the horizon. The monk touched the ground and whispered, "Rome." No one knew what that meant anymore, but they followed the road. For days, they walked upon the ghosts of empire. Broken statues watched them pass, kings, gods, soldiers, their faces worn blank by centuries. The wanderers did not bow, did not pray. They simply walked. The age of monuments was over. Now only footsteps mattered. That night, they camped by the ruins of an aqueduct. Mira sang softly, her voice carried by the wind. The hunter asked her what the song meant. "It's not about meaning," she said. "It's about remembering sound." Her words lingered long after she slept. In the morning, they found tracks near their camp, Human, small, recent. The boy with the wind voices smiled. "We're not alone," he said. And for the first time, no one was afraid. They followed the tracks for 2 days, until they vanished into mist. The monk said perhaps they were meant to disappear, that the world was giving them a choice, to keep chasing ghosts, or to make something new. Eric closed his father's map and looked east. "The world ended once," he said. "Let's see how it begins." And so they walked, not to escape the past, but to carry it forward. Their steps were light, but behind them, the grass straightened slowly, as if the land itself was learning to stand again. The farther they walked, the dimmer the world became. It was not darkness, not truly, just an absence of brilliance, a color of memory. The sun still shone, but weakly, as if this place had refused to forgive it. Eric was the first to notice. "The light here doesn't move," he said. And it was true. The shadows did not crawl as hours passed. They only deepened, like stains on old fabric. The wanderers had entered a valley of stillness. Trees grew, but without birds. Streams flowed, but made no sound. Even the wind moved differently, as though it were remembering how to be wind. Mira whispered, "The year never ended here." Have you ever stood in a place that feels alive, yet asleep? They found a village that had not changed since the famine years. The houses still stood, their doors half open, their tables still set. Bowls of petrified grain waited for hands that would never return. Everything was coated in a thin film of gray dust, volcanic, ancient, patient. Inside one hut, Eric found a small wooden cross lying on a windowsill. It was warm to the touch. He dropped it, startled. The monk smiled faintly. "Some faiths never die," he murmured. By night, they camped on the edge of the abandoned square. Mira sang again, softly, the same lullaby she used in the valley. But here, her voice echoed back, warped and delayed, as though the air itself were reluctant to let go of sound. Even their fire seemed dimmer, the flame curling low like a frightened animal. Eric dreamed of people walking beneath that unmoving sun, their faces hollow, their eyes searching for warmth that would never return. He woke before dawn, sweating despite the cold. They traveled on, following a broken road carved through blackened hills. Sometimes they passed fields of stone, places where crops had turned to ash and frozen mid-growth. The boy who heard the wind stopped often, listening. "They're still here," he said. "Who?" asked Mira. "The ones who didn't believe it would end." The monk placed his hand on the cracked earth. "Perhaps belief kept them," he said, "or bound them." For 3 days, they walked without seeing another living soul. Only traces, a footprint in hardened mud, a torn scrap of cloth, a whisper caught in the reeds. They began to wonder if this land even belonged to time anymore. Have you ever found a place where the past refuses to die, and the present dares not enter? On the 4th evening, they saw a glow ahead. Not sunlight, but something else, a pale fire burning in a circle of stones. As they approached, they saw figures standing around it, thin, silent, unmoving. Eric called out, but no one answered. He stepped closer, and the fire went out. The figures remained, still as statues. When the wind passed, they crumbled into dust. No one spoke for a long time. That night, they built no fire. They sat beneath the dim stars, wrapped in their cloaks, listening to the soundless wind. Mira said quietly, "Maybe the light never truly leaves. It just hides where no one dares to look." The monk nodded. "And maybe the darkness isn't evil. Maybe it's only what remains when memory forgets warmth." In the morning, they followed the old road farther north, where the hills opened into a plain littered with collapsed arches and broken stones. It must once have been a city, its streets wide, its towers tall. Now it was silent, buried halfway under earth and time. They climbed what was left of a stairway and looked out across the ruins. In the distance, faint glimmers of gold rippled in the mist. Rivers, perhaps, or reflections of something deeper. Eric whispered, "The lost roads end here." The monk shook his head. "No road ever ends," he said. It only waits for someone to walk it again. So they descended into the ruins, and there, in the hollow of an ancient courtyard, Mira found a tree, small, pale, trembling with new leaves. Its roots had cracked through stone. In its shade, the ground was warm. They knelt together, not in prayer, but in awe. The monk pressed his hand to the soil and smiled. "The sun remembers this place," he said. Eric took out a sketchbook and drew the tree, each leaf, each line of bark. When he finished, he wrote beneath it, "In the land that forgot light, something still grows." That night, when the stars rose above the ruins, they no longer seemed cold. The air held a different silence, not empty this time, but expectant. And for the first time since leaving the valley, the wanderers slept without fear. For 3 days after finding the pale tree, the wanderers followed the river that flowed beside the ruins. Its waters glimmered faintly, not gold, not silver, but the color of dawn remembered in a dream. The land grew softer, greener, almost gentle. It was as if the earth itself had taken a long breath after centuries of silence. Then, on the 4th morning, they saw it. A city, not in ruin, not buried, but whole. Towers stood unbroken, walls intact. Columns rose toward the dim sky like the ribs of a sleeping god. Smoke curled from chimneys. They could hear faint bells ringing. "Impossible," whispered Mira. The monk only smiled. Perhaps it never ended here. They entered through gates that stood open as if waiting. Inside, the streets were clean. Lanterns burned, their flames steady and colorless. People walked slowly, their faces calm but distant. They did not greet the strangers. They did not seem to notice them at all. Eric called out, but no one turned. Even the sound of his voice felt muffled, absorbed by the air like a secret. Have you ever walked through a dream so real that you feared waking would destroy it? A woman passed them, carrying a basket of bread that smelled faintly of ash. Her eyes were gray, not from blindness, but from remembering too much. When Mira reached to touch her shoulder, her hand met resistance, like pressing against glass. The woman continued walking, her motion unbroken. "They don't see us," said the monk softly, "or they see us, but have no use for seeing anymore." They followed the main street to a wide square. At its center stood a statue of the sun, a perfect golden disc held by 2 hands carved from white stone. Around it, people knelt in silent prayer. None moved. The air smelled faintly of incense and iron. Eric knelt beside them, trying to listen. He expected whispers, maybe songs. But the sound that filled the square was stranger, a soft humming, endless, neither joyful nor mournful. It seemed to echo inside the bones rather than the ears. The boy with the wind voices closed his eyes. "They're waiting," he said. "For what?" asked Mira. "For dawn." The monk nodded gravely. "And they've been waiting since 536. Every building they entered was the same, tidy, warm, untouched by decay. Yet there was no laughter, no conversation. Meals sat forever half-eaten. Candles never melted. The clocks had stopped, all at the same hour dawn. It dawned on them. The city itself was trapped inside that moment when the sun had disappeared. An echo made solid, a memory repeating itself through centuries. Have you ever seen a place that refused to move on? They reached the cathedral just before twilight. Inside, the light was soft and golden, though no sun could be seen. Choirs of children stood frozen mid-song, their mouths open in perfect harmony, their eyes empty as still water. Behind the altar burned a single flame, tall, unwavering. The monk approached it, trembling. "This fire," he whispered, "has been burning since the day the light went out." He knelt, tears in his eyes. "Even if it's an illusion," he said, "let it be a beautiful one." Eric stepped forward and placed his hand near the flame. It was warm, truly warm, the first real warmth he had felt since leaving the valley. He looked back at the others. "It's alive," he said. "The world is still alive." For a moment, they all believed it. The stillness, the light, the quiet perfection. It felt sacred. But then, faintly, the humming deepened, rising like a sigh from the very stones. The people in the square turned their heads as one. Their eyes shone gold. Mira gasped. They can see us now. The monk whispered, no. We've stepped into their time. The air shimmered. The city flickered, old, then new, then old again. The statues cracked, then mended, then cracked once more. The light wavered, not like fire, but like memory fighting to stay real. Eric shouted, run. They fled through the gates as the city began to fade behind them, its towers dissolving into mist, its bells tolling a soundless farewell. When they reached the river, they looked back. The city was gone. Only the faint reflection of golden towers rippled on the water's surface. Mira knelt beside it, her hands trembling. Was it real? She asked. The monk smiled sadly. Everything that waits long enough becomes real again, even dreams. They slept that night on the riverbank, the hum of the vanished city still echoing faintly in their ears. And when dawn came, the sun rose, steady, warm, almost forgiving. For the first time in centuries, it felt like the world was finally learning how to wake. When the world began to wake, it did so quietly. There were no trumpets, no gods returning, no sudden blaze of revelation. Only light, pale at first, then gold, spilling across the broken fields like a gentle apology. And from that light came the children. They were born in villages that had once been ruins. Their first lullabies were the songs of wind through new leaves. Their laughter carried no shadow. They had never seen a sky that did not forgive. The elders called them the children of the dawn. Eric and Mira found the first of them on a journey north, in a valley where the grass grew thick and silver under the sun. The children were building something, small towers of stone, arranged in circles. When asked why, they said, so the light doesn't forget where to come back. It was a simple answer, but it made the monk weep. Have you ever looked at someone so young that they make you remember what hope feels like? The children had strange eyes, clear, almost luminous. Their skin held the warmth of sunlight even in shade. Some whispered that they carried fragments of the vanished sun inside them. Others said they were the world's apology for what it had done. When the wanderers told them stories of the dark years, the children listened politely, but without fear. They couldn't imagine it. A sky that refused to shine, a world without warmth. To them, the darkness was only a bedtime tale, distant as myth. Mira once asked a little girl named Anwen, do you know what it means to be afraid of the sky? The girl tilted her head. Why would I be afraid of something that gives me light? The question silenced the camp for a long time. Eric sketched the children often. He said they were the first faces in history, not shaped by hunger. When he looked at them, he saw not what had survived, but what had begun anew. The monk, however, worried. He told Mira one night, they do not fear, and without fear, how will they remember? Mira replied softly, maybe remembering isn't their task. Maybe it's ours. Have you ever wondered whether forgetting might sometimes be mercy? As the seasons turned, the wanderers stayed among the children. They taught them to read the stones of the keepers, to trace letters that spoke of famine and fire. But the children preferred to draw suns, hundreds of them, on walls, in sand, even on each other's arms. One boy drew a sun inside a circle and called it the eye of the world. When the monk asked what it saw, the boy said, everything that's left. In the evenings, when the light softened into amber, the children sang. Their songs had no words, only sounds that felt like the sky breathing. Sometimes, as they sang, the trees seemed to shimmer, not from wind, but from memory. Eric began to notice something else. Wherever the children played, plants grew faster. Flowers bloomed in impossible colors. The land itself seemed drawn to them, as if it recognized its own renewal. He told the monk, who smiled faintly, the earth is listening again, he said. It trusts them more than it ever trusted us. By the time the second summer came, the wanderers realized their journey was ending. They had crossed a lost world and found what waited beyond despair, life that had forgotten sorrow. On the morning they prepared to leave, the children gathered by the river. Anwen handed Eric a small stone, carved with the symbol of the sun. "So you don't get lost," she said. Eric smiled. "Do you think the light can lose us?" The girl shrugged. "Sometimes the light goes looking too." They left the valley at sunrise. Behind them, the children sang their wordless songs, their voices rising with the day. The sound followed the wanderers long after the village had vanished from sight. Mira looked back once. "They don't need our stories anymore," she said. The monk nodded. "No, but someday they'll make their own." And perhaps that was how it was meant to be. Not memory alone, nor forgetting, but the endless rhythm between the two. Darkness giving birth to light, and light, in turn, learning how to die gracefully. As the sun climbed higher, the river glittered beside them. Eric reached into his pack, took out the child's carved stone, and held it toward the sky. The light passed through it, scattering in golden rays across the path ahead. For the first time, he understood what it meant to walk not away from history, but toward whatever waited beyond it. And so they continued on, following the dawn, while behind them, the laughter of the new world echoed. Soft, bright, and endless. It began as a whisper. Not thunder, not storm, just a sound like the sky exhaling. The first drops fell so lightly that no one noticed. They slid down leaves, sank into the thirsty earth, and vanished. Then came the scent, that ancient perfume of dust meeting water. It rolled through the valleys like music. Every living thing paused. For the first time in generations, it was raining. The wanderers stood in silence, faces tilted upward. The rain fell warm, gentle, steady. Not the violent floods that had once torn rivers from their beds, but a calm, deliberate rhythm. The sky was learning how to be kind again. Mira was the first to smile. "It remembers us," she whispered. Eric laughed, his voice breaking. "No, Mira, we remember it. Have you ever smelled rain after forgetting it existed?" The drops darkened their cloaks, soaked their hair, ran down their hands. The monk lifted his palms to the sky and whispered a prayer that was not to any god, but to the act of return itself. "Forgive us for doubting you," he said. "Forgive us for surviving without wonder." The rain answered only with silence, a silence so full it became song. They walked back toward the valley of the children, following streams that had come alive again. The earth pulsed beneath their feet, soft and trembling. Everywhere, the color green rose from the ground like resurrection. When they reached the valley, the children were already dancing, their arms outstretched, their laughter rising above the rain's steady drumming. None sought shelter. Even the animals, deer, birds, small wild things, moved among them without fear. Mira joined them first, spinning, her dark hair plastered against her face. Then Eric followed, his sketchbook forgotten, his pages melting into watercolor under the storm. The monk stood for a long time at the edge of the field, tears mixing with the rain. "This," he murmured, "is what we prayed for and feared we'd never earn." Have you ever watched the world cry and realized it wasn't sadness, but relief? For days, the rain did not stop, but no one worried. They built catchments from clay, carved new channels to guide the streams, sang to the rhythm of the falling sky. The sound of rain became the heartbeat of life again. Old seeds, buried and forgotten since the years of famine, began to sprout. Tiny shoots pierced the soil, stubborn, miraculous. The children ran from sprout to sprout, naming each one like a friend. "This is hope," said Anwen, pointing to a blade of grass. "This one's called again." By the seventh day, the valley shimmered emerald and gold. The river, once thin as memory, now roared with strength. Its surface reflected the sky, still gray, but alive, full of movement and promise. At night, they gathered around a fire beneath the dripping trees. The rain had softened to mist. Eric opened his last blank page and began to draw. Not ruins this time, not loss. He drew the curve of a drop, the way it caught the firelight, the way it mirrored the stars. He wrote beneath it, "The sky forgave itself." The monk looked over his shoulder. "Do Do you think it ever truly forgot? Eric shook his head. No, the sky doesn't forget. It just waits for us to listen again. When the rain finally stopped, the world did not feel clean. It felt whole. The earth exhaled steam. The rivers sang to themselves. The trees seemed taller. And everywhere, the air hummed with something ancient and tender. Balance. The children gathered puddles in their hands and held them to the light, watching the sun's reflection ripple and break. Look, Anwin said. The sky is inside the water now. The monk smiled. Maybe it always was. Have you ever realized that every ending was just the world learning to breathe again? That night, as the stars returned, they heard a new sound: frogs, insects, the hidden orchestra of a reborn earth. The silence of centuries had ended. The world was speaking again, softly, endlessly, like a lullaby made of water. And under that vast, living sky, the wanderers finally slept, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Long after the rains had come and gone, when rivers sang again and the children no longer feared the sky, one man remained behind. The others had gone north: Mira, Eric, the boy who heard the wind. They followed the rivers to the new lands, where the earth was still young and unmarked. But the monk stayed. He was old now, his hair white as winter ash, his hands ink-stained and trembling. He lived in a small hut by the river, built from the stones of the vanished world. Each morning, he walked to the hill overlooking the valley and watched the sunrise, just to remind himself that it still existed. He had become the last keeper. His task was simple, though endless, to remember. He kept scrolls filled with stories of famine, of faith, of the day rain returned. He wrote not to preserve despair, but to protect understanding, because forgetting, he knew, was how the darkness began. Have you ever loved something so deeply that you chose to stay behind for it? Some nights, the children would visit him. They brought fruit, bread, questions. "Why do you write so much, old father?" they would ask. He smiled. "Because one day, you will forget how the world began again." They didn't understand. How could they? Their lives were filled with color and warmth, the quiet abundance of a healed world. They had never felt the hunger of a sky gone silent. When they left, he listened to their laughter fading down the path and whispered, "Good, forget a little longer." The monk's hut filled slowly with pages, some written, some blank, waiting for a hand that might never come. On one wall, he had carved a single phrase, repeating it over and over until the stone had worn smooth. Light returns, but only if remembered. At dusk, he lit a small candle. Its flame flickered gently, reflecting in his eyes. He sometimes imagined it was the last ember of the vanished sun, entrusted to him alone. Outside, the valley glowed with green and gold. The river murmured below, steady as breath. He had learned to hear the language of water, its rise and fall, its slow syllables of renewal. It was the only voice that never lied. Have you ever realized that silence can be a kind of prayer? One evening, as twilight deepened, he took out an old scrap of parchment, the first he had ever written, long ago, when the world was still half broken. The ink had faded, but he could still make out the words. "If the world forgets this, it will happen again." He pressed his thumb to the page, sealing it with the weight of his years. Then he smiled. "I think we've earned a little forgetting," he whispered. That night, he dreamed of the old days, of famine fields and empty cities. But in his dream, the ruins were blooming. Children played where statues had once stood, their laughter echoing through halls of stone. Even the sky, once bronze and cold, shone clear and endless. When dawn came, the children found his door open. The candle still burned, its flame steady and bright. On the table lay his final entry, written in a shaky hand. The world no longer needs keepers. It has learned to remember itself. Beside the parchment was his quill, still wet with ink. And outside, beneath the great silver-green tree that had watched generations pass, the monk sat peacefully, eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. The children did not cry. They took his scrolls to the hilltop and placed them beneath stones, sealing them against the wind. Then they stood in silence, heads bowed, as a soft breeze carried the scent of rain through the valley. From that day on, no one wrote of the dark years again, but every spring, when the first storm rolled over the hills, they would gather and whisper his words to the rain. Light returns, but only if remembered. And somewhere deep in the earth, perhaps, the last keeper smiled, content that remembering had finally become living. The years turned gently now. No great storms, no vanished suns, no trembling prayers. The world had finally slowed to the rhythm of its own heart. Morning arrived without warning, not as a miracle, not as mercy, but as something natural again. The people no longer counted years from the darkness. Children no longer asked what had come before the rain. The story of the vanished sun became a legend told beside fires, softened by time until sorrow turned into wonder. No one remembered the old monk's face, though they still spoke his words. Light returns, but only if remembered. They did not understand it, not fully, but maybe they didn't need to. Have you ever realized that peace isn't when the noise stops? It's when you no longer need to listen for danger? The Valley of the Keepers became a garden. Rivers ran clear, fields golden. Where ruins once stood, wildflowers bloomed in colors no one had seen before the great dimming. The silver-green tree by the river had grown enormous, its roots deep, its leaves shimmering even on windless days. Some said it glowed at night. Others said it hummed when rain was near. No one argued. They simply lived, as if the world had decided to love them again. Mira spent her last years near the tree, teaching the young ones to sing the old songs, not in mourning, but in gratitude. When she sang, the children joined her, their voices rising like sunlight over the hills. Sometimes, travelers passing through would pause, unsure if what they heard was music or prayer. Eric, older now, had filled dozens of books with sketches, rivers, children, faces, clouds. No battles, no ruins. When asked why, he said, "Because beauty is what we nearly lost." One morning, as dawn bled slowly across the sky, he climbed the same hill where the wanderers had once stood so many years ago. The air was cool, filled with the smell of wet earth and blooming grass. The world below shimmered, rivers glinting like veins of light through the living body of the earth. He sat, opened his last book, and began to draw, not the sun itself, but its reflection in a drop of dew resting on a blade of grass. It was enough. Have you ever seen something so small it reminded you of eternity? Below him, children ran through the fields, their laughter carrying on the breeze. They were the great-grandchildren of the first generation born after the darkness, the children of the dawn. They had no reason to fear the sky, and maybe that was the greatest blessing of all. By mid-morning, clouds gathered. A soft drizzle began to fall, the kind that cools without chilling, that feeds without flooding. The people lifted their faces to it, smiling. Somewhere in that rain, the voices of the old keepers seemed to whisper again. The sky forgave itself. When the storm passed, a rainbow arched across the horizon, faint but steady. The children cheered. To them, it was not a miracle. It was simply what the sky did when it wanted to smile. That night, the stars came out one by one, each flicker a heartbeat, each pulse a promise. Eric sat beneath the silver-green tree, his sketchbook resting on his lap, and felt the warmth of the earth rise through the soles of his feet. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear the voices of all who had walked before him. Alara, the monk, Mira, the wanderers, the lost cities, the nameless dead. Not speaking, not lamenting, just breathing with him. The world had learned something in the years after the sun's return, that survival is not defiance, it's remembrance. Have you ever thought that maybe the light didn't vanish at all? That it only waited for us to stop fighting it? The last line Eric ever wrote was simple. We no longer ask the sun to return. We only thank it for staying. And in the hush that followed, the earth exhaled, a soft, endless sigh of completion. The age of ruin was over. The light had learned to stay.